Chapter 12 Talpiots in Space. After Marina Gundlin graduated from the academic portion of Talpiot, she gravitated to research and development in Israel's aerospace industry. When missile attacks from Gaza once again began to escalate in December 2008, she was tasked to improve Israel's early warning alarm system so that people in Israeli communities close to the border with Gaza could have a decent chance of finding cover before impact. It was critical to design ways to make the alert system work faster. If there is only a 30-second warning and it takes a full 4 or 5 seconds to detect a launch and determine the missile's direction, saving 2 or 3 seconds could save someone's life. Marina explains, "My branch had responsibility for watching the skies of Israel, planes, air traffic control, and everything else that goes through the sky. Since we have the radar for planes, we also have radar for missiles. I handled a lot of the launches and the hit points, which is very important because it lets you know which civilian population you need to alarm before the rocket hits. We were trying to help the army figure out where projectiles are going. I needed to determine where the missiles were going to hit and then quickly relay the coordinates. It was my responsibility to decide how many areas and how many sectors to alert after a launch. After a series of launches, Marina would take the data from missile launches and where they landed and enter it into a special computer program designed to help the army learn from past attacks. This could help determine likely strike areas in the future. After a new ceasefire went into effect January 18, 2009, Marina began planning her next step, working in Israel's satellite industry. In 1988, Israel launched its first satellite, the Ofek, Hebrew for Horizon. That successful launch turned Israel into the 8th nation to have a native satellite launch capability. Since then, 9 Ofeks have been launched into outer space from Israel. It's believed the Ofek satellites make about 6 passes over Earth each day. Israel also uses the Amos series of satellites launched from the territory of other nations, often former republics of the Soviet Union. The Amos satellites are usually for communications purposes. The Ofek is not. Its purpose is to take high-resolution image photography of any place on Earth. The Israeli army and other intelligence agencies are usually the beneficiaries of what the Ofek satellites send back from outer space. Grundlin's job in the Ofek program is to squeeze out every piece of data the satellites pick up. She develops algorithms to take advantage of the treasure trove of data and images that comes home. Marina laughs, "Don't think I'm looking at license plates or faces. In the satellite industry, people are laughing at this concept of being able to see faces and license plates. There's this movie with Will Smith, Enemy of the State. You have real-time images. They follow him with the satellites. You can see if he's sitting, standing or smiling. You really can't get that from satellites." While Israel's satellite program does not live up to Hollywood fantasies, Marina says she's coming up with programs that help the army and intelligence agencies find whatever they're looking for whenever they're looking for it. While Grundlin's ambition was to be part of the aerospace industry, Kobi Kamenetz had no clue where his true interest was until a routine class trip turned his life around. Quiet and thoughtful, Kobi's Talpiot commanders had high hopes for him the minute he was inducted into Talpiot's 16th class. They believed he could make a difference in Israel's future on a grand scale. Kamenetz had other plans. He wanted to go into the army to become a fighter, a commander of troops in the field. He was all set to tell his Talpiot superiors, who had invested so much in his education, that he wanted to enroll in a field commander's course. It's not clear how they would have reacted, and it doesn't matter. He never had that conversation. One day, his Talpiot class was on a field trip to see parts of the Israeli space program in the works. When they went into a hangar and he saw the satellite Ofek 4, "That was really magic for me," he recalls. "I vividly remembered watching the launch of Ofek 3 on television. Then I was able to see another Israeli rocket launch in person. I knew then that this is what I wanted to do. It was fascinating. You see it on the ground 1 minute, then a few minutes later it's 400 kilometers in space. I knew I wanted to be part of that." After his 3rd year at Talpiot coursework, he spent the next 6 years working on the camera for Ofek 5. At the age of only 21, he was working on a $100 million project crucial to his country's defense. When asked how he was able to get this top priority post, Kobi was extremely modest, saying, "Someone somewhere thought I was a good multitasker and was easy to work with." Of course, both of these qualities are extremely valuable, but Kobi had a lot more than that. extreme motivation to help his country, a desire to work hard, and a world-class education in military technology. On May 28, 2002, the Associated Press in Jerusalem reported, the Ofek 5 reconnaissance satellite was successfully launched and will soon begin providing Israel with high-resolution images of the Middle East. Defense Minister Benjamin Ben-Eliezer said that the satellite and its launcher rocket, developed entirely in Israel, were a tremendous achievement for the Israeli defense establishment. The Ofek 5 satellite, developed by Israel Aircraft Industries, IAI, rocketed into space on board a Shavit launcher at 6:25 p.m. from the Palmachim Air Force Base. The Shavit's engines shot out a huge white vapor trail as the rocket sped westward over the Mediterranean. Minutes later, the rocket and satellite disappeared over the horizon. Looking back, Kobe says, I remember the clock ticking down, from 9 hours down to minutes, down to seconds. I was testing the camera to make sure that everything was okay in the monitor I was looking at. There are also a lot of different configurations you can work with. Exposure time, the shutter. It is just like your camera. The camera on the Ofek is a very complex equivalent. I could tell it to take pictures of this point on Earth, that point on Earth. You switch and test to make sure you can see the inputs, of which there are several dozen, given your different views. To play a part in this was really a great experience. When the first image from the satellite came in, there was nothing I could compare that to. He then worked with demanding Israeli intelligence agencies after the launch to provide them with whatever they wanted. After a short time, Kamenetz was able to provide them with images without being asked, as he was able to figure out what they needed. Intelligence officers would often bring him pictures of other targets, asking him to check for updates on everything from weaponry to troop movement to the placement of tanks and missile launchers throughout the Middle East. The intelligence teams also had instructions when it came to optimizing the pictures of what they wanted to see, and they were very specific in requesting size and shading so they could be 100% sure of what was happening on the ground. After working on the Ofek 5 camera, Kobe wound up leaving the army, saying it would be difficult for him to find something as inspiring to work on. Not long thereafter, he wound up using the skills he had acquired to work on very similar technology in the private sector to help patients in danger of losing their eyesight. Israel's space program and electro-optics are the expertise of Tal Dekel of Talpiot's 17th class 1995. Dekel is currently a research fellow at Tel Aviv University's Yuval Ne'eman Workshop for Science, Technology and Security, which was founded by General Yitzhak Ben Israel, the outstanding individual whom we met in Chapter 7. The department focuses on a wide range of security issues through the prism of science. On the list is cybersecurity, Israeli space policy, guided weapons, ballistic missile technology, nuclear energy and robotics, to name a few. When it comes to space, the program focuses on using satellites for improving intelligence gathering. While motives and intentions of a foreign leader can be debated, satellite imagery gives a clear picture of what's happening on the ground. Through his work at Ne'eman, Dekel has been called upon to analyze the progress being made in space by nations in Israel's neighborhood, including Egypt, a country many people, even those in security circles, didn't know had a space program. Dekel isn't impressed. Egypt says its satellite program is for scientific use, but many experts believe a country like Egypt, a nation with a questionable economy and a powerful military, wouldn't spend so much money purely for civilian purposes. Dekel believes that, as in most countries, their program is for dual use, military and civilian. In 2007, Dekel helped monitor the launch of EgyptSat-1. Egypt was able to reach space with the generous support of scientists and space experts in the Ukraine. But by 2010, communications were lost with EgyptSat-1, and dozens of Egyptians who had worked on the program were fired. Dekel says the Egyptian government hid the bad news for months. Among his other responsibilities, Dekel often represents Israel at international and United Nations-sponsored space conferences. In the spring of 2011, he was in Geneva. He gave a presentation proposing international rules for the management and governance of space, rules that every nation would need to abide by to prevent one nation from interfering with another beyond Earth's atmosphere. One example where space rules are needed relates to jamming signals. Many countries have the ability to stop signals from coming into their countries. Dekel notes that Iran is actually a world leader in jamming technology and there's no way to prevent it. Deckel says you can retaliate by jamming their signals, but in the end, nobody in that scenario really wins. All the money that went into satellite launches and the sending back of signals is lost. Beyond jamming, it is also possible to blind satellites with certain kinds of lasers, another area where international rules are badly needed. A remarkable thing happened when Deckel presented his proposal in Geneva. Almost always, Iran's representatives and the representatives of many Arab nations boycott speeches given by Israeli experts at international conferences, including conferences run by the United Nations. But to Deckel's recollection, when he spoke, it was the first time that the representatives of Iran did not leave the room. Chapter 13, Missile Command. We first met Ophir Shoham in Chapter 8, when the Talpiot cadet launched a 6-foot, 200-pound paratrooper 10 feet in the air for picking on one of his classmates. Since then, Shoham became the highest-ranking and most prolific graduate of Talpiot in the military. He rose through the ranks of the Israel Defense Forces, the Navy, where he commanded a missile boat, and the Ministry of Defense, to become a brigadier general in the reserves and the head of Mafat, the administration for the development of weapons and technological infrastructure. General Shoham also holds a seat on the all-powerful General Staff. In this position, he became responsible for pushing forward missile defense. Israel now has defenses capable of shooting down 3 types of missiles. The Iron Dome hit short-range rockets. It was first deployed in 2011, but it became famous during Operation Pillar of Defense in 2012. David Sling, which is not yet fully operational, but is ready to go. It is designed to take down missiles fired from 18 to 180 miles away. David Sling is also sometimes known within Israel as Magic Wand. The Arrow system, the most complicated and perhaps the most important, was developed to defeat long-range ballistic missiles that could be fired from launch sites in Iran. Shoham and Talpiot graduates have been essential in the technology behind each and every one of them. It was a perfect project for a Talpiot graduate, and many Talpiots inclined to this area of Israel's defense. Missile defense is a complicated project that requires a major multidiscipline approach. Designers need to take into account the highest level mathematics, physics, radar detection, propulsion, explosive charges, the vehicle itself, along with communications, to name a few of the required disciplines necessary for successful missile defense. Then appropriate areas for deployment, where the anti-missile battery will have maximum impact, must be determined. And the people working on all those different areas must get along well enough to move the project forward together quickly. According to a professor who was involved with Talpiot's student projects, the idea for Iron Dome was first dreamed up by a group of cadets in the 1990s, when Hamas began firing short-range homemade rockets and mortars at Israeli communities in the Gaza Strip. Projectile attacks on communities such as Gush Katif and Dugit became more and more frequent. The rockets were very primitive, more like mortars, and while they weren't doing a lot of physical damage, the psychological effect on the population under attack was becoming significant. Retired Colonel Shaul Shai, former deputy head of the Israel National Security Council, says, "The government didn't consider these attacks as a serious threat, but if you lived in Gaza and your home was coming under attack, you wanted it stopped. The question was how." Hamas's rockets, later called Qassams, named for Izz ad-Din al-Qassam, who made a name for himself attacking Jewish people living in the Haifa area in the 1930s, became more sophisticated and more dangerous over time. From the mortar-like ordnance in the 1990s, they evolved into larger and more aerodynamic missiles, sometimes made with the long metal canisters found inside traffic lights, stuffed with explosives, nails and ball bearings. After the rockets were fired, the launchers could be easily and quickly hidden. The IDF wasn't sure how to stop the attacks. They couldn't cover enough of the Gaza Strip from the air or by land to catch the men firing the rockets red-handed. After a missile firing, the terrorists most often blended back into the civilian population and hid their launchers, sometimes in homes, schools or mosques, and more recently in sophisticated underground bunkers. It was a cat-and-mouse game between the IDF soldiers stationed in Gaza and small groups of nimble Hamas terrorists who knew the topography and cities better than Israeli troops knew them. Israel didn't want to send soldiers in to attack these small nests of terrorists every time there was a rocket launch. First off, it wasn't an effective method. Secondly, most often they'd be playing on Hamas's terms and on their territory. Most importantly, the IDF would suffer casualties. In Israel, it's a front-page story when a soldier is wounded. It's the lead story on television news and the lead story on news radio, which airs on almost every station in the nation at the top of each hour. Everyone in the country hears the details quickly and cares about him. Hamas also had other ways of attacking Israelis. They left roadside bombs, they periodically inflicted shooting attacks, and starting in the early 1990s, they were able to terrify Israeli citizens with suicide bombings. These attacks really became a serious problem for Israel in 1994, when they almost exclusively targeted civilian buses, nightclubs, cafes, bars and restaurants, killing dozens of Israelis at a time and injuring even more. For the first time in quite a while, Israelis were running scared and were constantly looking over their shoulders. After watching the escalated rocket attacks for a few months, a group of Talpiot cadets decided to focus their second-year class project on a fairly low-cost solution to stop Hamas rockets. It was a clever presentation, and it caught the attention of some of Israel's top military research and development officers. But the idea didn't go far in its first iteration. The military was not ready to implement such a system, but the Talpiot idea and the prototype they developed was a start. In 2012, Ophir Shoham was appointed head of planning in the IDF. Along with the head of Mafat Research and Development, General Daniel Gold, the man largely credited with developing the modern iteration of Iron Dome, Shoham pushed the missile defense system as a solution to the short-range missile threats. Engineers at the Ministry of Defense then began taking the concept of Iron Dome more seriously, believing it could be a realistic solution to a threat they correctly believed would only become worse in the years ahead. Their plans ran into major obstacles from the army. Many generals argued vociferously that it was the army's job to bring the war to the enemy, to be on the offence, not to spend money on unproven defensive measures. Fighting belongs on enemy territory, they persisted, not in Israel. But in 2005, Prime Minister Ariel Sharon shocked much of Israel. The man known for breaking the bones of Arabs who threatened Israel uprooted the 8,000 Jews living in Gaza and forced them to move inside Israel's internationally recognized borders or to Judea and Samaria, areas known in the West as the West Bank. Many in Israel and the world hoped this would be the first step toward peace with the Palestinians. Sharon himself called it a test to see if the Palestinians were really ready for peace. He wanted to see what would happen if they were given autonomy. The world quickly found out. Hamas violently took over the Gaza Strip, destroyed infrastructure and greenhouses left behind, and turned Gaza into a launching pad for Qassam rockets, and later for longer-range, more sophisticated weaponry like Russian-made and Iranian-supplied Katyusha rockets that could reach further inside of Israel. Between 2001, when the Qassams were first fired, and 2012, there have been more than 10,000 rocket attacks against Israel fired from Gaza. More than 90% of those attacks came after Israel left Gaza. Despite objections from many army generals, Defense Minister Amir Peretz, one of the least popular defense ministers in Israel's history, became an early backer of funding Iron Dome when he took office in 2006. For Peretz, it was an easy decision. He grew up in Sderot, which had been a constant target of Hamas rockets, and was extremely sympathetic to people forced to endure the dangers and disruptions to daily life caused by missile fire from Gaza. It was his final decision that allowed more funding to start flowing into the project. In an in-depth article in the Times of Israel, Mitch Ginsburg reported, in February 2007, with funding for just 1 year and without the requisite signature of the finance minister necessary for all multi-year projects, Peretz authorized the development of Iron Dome. At a midnight meeting in his office, he reached an agreement with Rafael Defense Systems officials. They'd scrape together $50 million, and the Defense Ministry would scrape together another $50 million out of an annual budget of some $15 billion, and production would start immediately. The engineers working on the project were able to show the Ministry of Defense a working model 3 years later. In the meantime, though, the rockets continued to fall. The attacks forced Israel to launch Operation Cast Lead at the end of 2008 through the beginning of 2009. Throughout the fighting, Hamas and other groups launched hundreds of rockets at civilian areas. The government was under pressure to find a solution to protect civilians from the constant threat. Israelis in the communities within rocket range of Gaza complained that if the rockets were falling on Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, the government would have had an answer. The army would retaliate harshly. There were calls for the government to reinforce the roofs of homes, schools and community centres to protect civilians. Many Israelis knew of the work being done on the Iron Dome due to news reports, and there was intense public pressure to set it up fast. In March 2011, the Iron Dome system was first deployed in the Negev desert to protect cities and towns closest to Gaza. The Ministry of Defense made the move with little fanfare, but a lot of internal debate. The system had not yet been fully tested. It was called a hot rollout to further downplay expectations. On the early rollout, Brigadier General Shoham was quoted in the Israeli daily Haaretz saying, "Senior defense officials were right when they made this decision. At the Administration for the Development of Weapons and Technological Infrastructure, we felt it would be proper to go ahead, even if the Air Force had reservations. It is not that they opposed this, but they were deliberating. We could have not deployed the system, absorbed casualties, and the politicians would have had less room to maneuver. In such a situation, we could have absolved ourselves by claiming the system simply was not ready, but the direction was clear and there was an excellent combination of operational planning and technological and logistical support. In my understanding, we were ready enough to take a calculated risk here, and it is not all that great a risk, because the trials were 100% successful." Iron Dome is made of three main parts: a radar station, the control center, and the interceptor battery, which launches the anti-missile projectile. A number of Israeli defense contractors are credited with manufacturing the system, including the biggest names in the Israeli defense industry, Israel Aerospace Industry, Elta and Rafael, as well as many of their subsidiaries. The radar, of course, tracks incoming missiles, but it goes a step further, telling the command crew which incoming missiles pose a threat to communities and which ones don't. Firing an anti-missile from Iron Dome is a relatively expensive endeavour. Hamas is able to make Qassams for a few $100s a pop. The anti-missile projectiles cost Israel about $38,000 every time one is launched, so having the system prevent waste is important. But Israeli officials are very quick to point out that despite the discrepancy in cost between what Hamas fires and what Israel pays to combat those missiles, if the incoming missile hit cars, homes and neighbourhoods, the cost of repairs would be much higher than $38,000, so you can't compare the cost missile to missile. They also point out the $38,000 is obviously more than a fair trade when it comes to saving somebody's life. Shoham also told Haaretz, "We have no pretension of intercepting thousands of missiles, only of gaining time, limiting the threat, and in the meantime, the army is also doing other things. We must not forget that the system also contributes considerably to Israel's deterrent capability." The first real test came on April 7, 2011. When a Russian-made Grad rocket capable of travelling 25 miles was fired from Gaza in the direction of Beersheba, the largest city in southern Israel, home to 200,000 people. Those who witnessed history being made say the Iron Dome's radar picked up the incoming missile. The system tracked it and within milliseconds determined it would likely hit a populated area. Sirens wailed, lights flashed, the young men and women in the command centre began shouting commands and following orders. The anti-missile was launched. With a short, loud explosion, it shot into the air. 3 seconds, 4 seconds, 5 seconds, 10 seconds later, an explosion could be seen in the sky, followed by a loud boom. Success! At a cabinet meeting a few days later, Prime Minister Netanyahu said, "Israel marked a significant and impressive achievement with the Iron Dome system intercepting missiles. This has echoed throughout the world." More successful interceptions would follow in the weeks and months ahead. The army reports that during the April 2011 escalation with Gaza, the Iron Dome had a 65% success rate. That was the month the system began operating. In August 2011, during another round of missile attacks, the Iron Dome success rate hit 70%. In March 2012, Iron Dome had an 80% success rate. In June 2012, the Iron Dome's hit rate reached 85%. In October of that year, the success rate hit 95%. More rocket attacks and Hamas's acquisition of missiles that could hit Tel Aviv led to a new round of intense fighting in November 2012, with Israel launching Operation Pillar of Defense. During Operation Pillar of Defense, 1,506 rockets were fired at Israel from Gaza. The Iron Dome system determined that 421 of those rockets were a threat, and 85% of those threats were destroyed in mid-air. The Ministry of Defense says it does not keep exact statistics on successful launches, but they do believe that with some tweaking, the system can be close to 100% effective in the years to come. There is optimism within Israel's defense community that the Iron Dome will be sought after by other countries and will add to the Israeli-made weapons system the country sells and exports. As of winter 2015, no agreements have been signed. While Talpiot originally dreamed up the system, and the highest-ranking Talpiot grad, Ophir Shoham, was partially responsible for making it happen, with the help of the Israeli military industry, the United States was a big factor in paying for Iron Dome. Congress approved about $500 million in funding for the project, and in June 2013, lawmakers tacked on another $15 million in funding in the hope that the US could collaborate directly in future developments. That same month, the House of Representatives Armed Services Committee approved $284 million to help pay for programs designed to team up with Israel in the field of missile defense. Israel and the United States have been working together on longer-range missile defense systems for decades. The two jointly developed the Arrow anti-missile system. The Arrow is now in its third generation and is mainly designed with the threat of Iran's ballistic missile program in mind. It is considered to be the world's best long-range missile interceptor. Production of the Arrow began in 1986, the same year Talpiot students were starting to make a name for themselves in Israel's space program. Israel's space scientists made a huge contribution to the Arrow because, in effect, it is a rocket. The Arrow is tasked with streaking approximately 30 miles above the Earth's surface, seeking out incoming missiles and then exploding, knocking out the enemy projectile. One of its many goals is to destroy any incoming missile armed with nuclear, biological or chemical warheads far enough into the sky that the deadly payload doesn't hit Israel. The Arrow is jointly developed by Boeing and Israel Aerospace Industries at a cost of about $3 million per missile. The rockets run on solid fuel rather than more volatile liquid fuel. Solid fuel also gives the Arrow missile commanders the luxury of not having to deploy the rockets shortly before they're used. In other words, they're always ready to go on the launch pad. That's key because missile defense often can't be planned. An interceptor like the Arrow is only used when an enemy fires its missiles, so timing is unpredictable, to put it mildly. Like the Iron Dome system, the rocket launchers don't operate independently. Instead, there is a command center, a separate radar station, and the battery that actually fires the missiles. The Arrow 1, 2 and 3 have all been successfully test-fired in actual simulations, and the system has proven it can take out enemy missiles. In test phases, physicists, engineers and Israeli soldiers manning the Arrow batteries claim the Arrow has a 90% success rate. Many in the world of aerospace, including some Israeli experts, have long doubted the effectiveness of the Arrow. Some in the Israeli defense establishment have even said that billions of dollars spent on the Arrow system would be better used elsewhere. Others say the Arrow might work but could be defeated with decoys. That is to say, if an enemy country fired 50 missiles at Israel and only one was armed with a nuclear warhead, with the other 49 being decoys, the Arrow would not be able to save the day. One Israeli physicist with in-depth knowledge of the capabilities of the Arrow, who also teaches in the Talpiot program, laughs off these fears. He agrees missile defense will never be 100% effective, but decoys can most definitely be defeated. Professor Azriel Lorber, a Talpiot teacher for almost 2 decades, attests, "Former students of mine from Talpiot worked on solving the decoy dilemma in the Arrow's early years. Decoys show off different flight characteristics, giving them away. It is also true that it's easier and cheaper for enemies to build a real missile than to build a good decoy. All of these factors are helpful in determining which is the real one and which isn't." The first Arrow battery was installed in Palmachim Air Base, south of Tel Aviv. Several successful test launches and test interceptions have been executed from the base. While the Arrow has not been used in a real-life situation, the officers who would be the ones firing at the enemy missile have been able to test a lot of their skills during the civil war in Syria. The Syrian army launched several Scud missiles in their attempt to quash the rebel uprising that began in 2011. Israel initially became very familiar with Scuds during the first Gulf War, when Saddam Hussein fired 36 of them at Israel in 1991. In 2011, 2012 and 2013, Syria's firing of Scuds set off alarm bells at Palmachim Air Base, forcing anti-missile teams to have their fingers on the triggers as radar tracked those launches inside of Syria. When Syria fires its Scuds, Israel tracks those missiles. They're doing it in part to test their tracking abilities and to study the way Syria fires the Scuds, but most importantly, Israel tracks them to make sure they're not being fired at Israel. The Ministry of Defense says that for the first few critical seconds, it is difficult to tell if attacks that go from north to south are aimed at rebel-held areas in Syria or if Israel is the target. In 2013, Colonel Tzvika Chaimovich told Reuters news service that after Bashar al-Assad's forces fire a missile, Israel only has a few seconds to determine if it is the target or not. Syria's batteries are in a high state of operability, ready to fire at short notice. All it would take is a few degrees change in the flight path to endanger us. In that same article, Colonel Chaimovich also told Reuters, "We are looking at all aspects, from the performance of the weaponry to the way the Syrians are using it. They have used everything that I am aware exists in their missile and rocket arsenal. They are improving all the time, and so are we. But we need to study this and to be prepared." The Reuters report continues. Long-range radars feed real-time data on the barrages to Chaimovich's command bunker, where officers brace to activate Arrow 2, a US-backed Israeli missile shield that has yet to be tested in battle. The more threatening launches set off sirens across Palmachim, whose warplanes also await orders to scramble. Chaimovich would not detail how Israel determines a missile fired in its direction will not cross the border, saying only that the process took more than a few seconds, but not much more. Another Israeli expert, speaking on condition of anonymity, said it combined split-second analysis of the strength of the launch with up-to-date intelligence on Assad's intentions. Israel also has developed a missile interceptor that's able to detect, track and destroy medium-range rockets heading into Israel. David Sling has its first successful test on November 25, 2012. It is in its final test stages and hopefully will be deployed in time for Israel's next inevitable war. It will be expected to take out rockets fired from up to 150 miles away. That would put missiles fired by terrorists or anyone else from Egypt's Sinai Desert within range. Over the past several years, dozens of missiles have targeted the Israeli port city of Eilat. The system, however, was designed with Syria and Lebanon in mind. Syria has missiles capable of striking anywhere in Israel. Lebanon is host to Hezbollah, which boasts it can hit anywhere in Israel with its impressive missile arsenal. In order to bring about a ceasefire after the Second Lebanon War, in the summer of 2006, the international community pledged to prevent Hezbollah from rearming. Despite that, Hezbollah is believed to have more than 40,000 missiles aimed at Israel and ready to go. Hezbollah possesses three main missiles, the Zelzal and the Fateh 110. Both are made and supplied by Iran. Zelzal is Persian for earthquake, Fateh means conqueror. The third missile category is the Russian-made Katyusha. The Zelzal and Fateh 100 are both capable of carrying 1,500-pound warheads and have an approximate range of 150 miles. That would put both missiles in the killable category for David Sling. Syria also possesses the Fateh 110, and reports say the Syrian army controlled by Bashar al-Assad has used them against rebels during Syria's civil war. The Katyusha is not as advanced as the Fateh 110 or the Zelzal, but it packs a major punch. It was used heavily by Hezbollah during the Second Lebanon War. It poses a threat to Israel because the missiles are often fired from mobile launchers. They can be fired quickly and in heavy volumes, then hidden from Israeli aircraft. David Sling is capable of dealing with all three of those missiles, and its main responsibility will be to prevent Hezbollah's missiles from damaging Israeli communities. With targeting and guidance devices implanted in the nose, David Sling interceptor missile is sometimes known as the Stunner. Compared to the Arrow missiles, the interceptor fired by David Sling is less expensive. There is no doubt that Israel's sophisticated missile defences will be of critical importance in the years ahead, as constant research and upgrading in this field will provide a much-needed sense of security for all of its citizens. Its cutting-edge development and far-reaching impact in large part reflect the work of Talpiot cadets and Talpiot graduates, not the least of whom is the visionary Brigadier General Ophir Shoham. Chapter 14. On a Mission. Giora Kornblau always wanted to fly. When it came time to serve in the IDF, he was certain he'd shoot for flight school. Giora wanted the Air Force, but Talpiot wanted Giora. As his 3 years of study started coming to a close, he opted to postpone working in research and development, the destination for most Talpiot graduates, and join the Air Force. He wanted to be a fighter pilot. Colonel Avi Poleg, who headed Talpiot at the time, usually encouraged graduates to consider combat service after graduation. When he and his staff would find a candidate for that kind of route, he would help the Talpiot graduate navigate the bureaucratic maze leading to combat posts. I find the combination of Talpiot and combat service to be an excellent way to get involved in major important domains in the defence area, says Poleg. After serving a period in the field, there is a potential for building a long and stable military career which may lead to the top. This was certainly the case for Kornblau, one of the first Talpiot graduates to go on to flight school. Born in Argentina in 1972, he was brought to Israel by his family 1 year later. When Talpiot recruited him, he had not heard of the program, but he would soon join as part of the 12th class inducted in 1990. When Kornblau announced his intention to go to flight school, there was no precedent for making such a move. All the rules were being written as Giora moved forward. Part of his argument was that for 3 years Talpiot had pressed upon his class the importance of combat training and the importance of getting your hands dirty in the field. They want people with a combination of an education and real combat experience. I agreed with them. He remembers, there were some bureaucratic hurdles. There are always roadblocks, but everyone always comes together at the last minute. I did need to do some convincing at the Ministry of Defence, which had invested in my education. At the end of Talpiot, there is a 3-month graduation project. In order to start flight school after graduating, I needed to miss that. There was a lot of discussion, but in the end, the Ministry of Defence and the leaders of Talpiot said, if you pass flight school, go ahead into the Air Force. The Air Force, however, was very black and white about the whole issue. They said, we don't need convincing, we just need you to pass the test. And like almost everything else Kornblau had done to this point in his life, he was a success. After passing his initial tests, the learning curve steepened. He began learning to fly combat-style missions on A-4 Skyhawks, now used for training in the Israeli Air Force. The planes were previously used by Israel in combat missions in the late 1960s and early 1970s, as well as in the early 1980s, in Operation Peace for the Galilee. As flying artillery, their main mission was to pound ground targets and provide cover for Israel's ground forces. After mastering the A-4s, he was taught to fly F-16s. The F-16 is known as Israel's long arm. Israel's fleet of about 225 F-16s can be refueled in mid-air and have been known to be capable of striking anywhere in the Middle East to the northern half of Africa, which has become a travel route for weapons sold to Hamas and other terrorist networks in Gaza and the Sinai. In June 2008, 100 Israeli F-16s and F-15s flew in formation toward Greece. The distance is about 900 miles, the same distance from Israel to Iran. Greece is armed with the Russian-made SA-300 anti-aircraft system, the same system Russia was reportedly considering selling to Iran. The point the Israeli Air Force was making was pretty blunt. It is ready to carry out any mission anywhere, at any time. The missions of Israeli Air Force pilots usually remain classified for decades after they have been carried out. Kornblau could only say he was called on to carry out missions in all the areas where the Israeli Air Force was active during his time as a pilot. During his time in service, the IDF carried out bombing missions against Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza, after both organizations had launched wave after wave of terrorist attacks against Israeli civilians. Israel also began targeting the leaders of those terrorist operations in an effort to cut off the head of the snake. Another theatre of operation during Kornblau's time in the Air Force was to the north of Israel in Lebanon. He flew during the final months of the Israeli army's occupation of southern Lebanon, which had begun in 1982. As the Lebanon-based PLO became less of a nuisance for Israel, Iranian-backed Hezbollah took over as resistance fighters, providing the IDF with targets for years to come. Since the early days, the fighter pilot has been known as a thinking man's warrior. You need to know how to operate the complicated controls, how to not stall in midair. You need to know physics and aerodynamics. You need to surmise what your opponent is able to do and when he will do it. Once in the air, Israeli Air Force pilots are given a lot of leeway to accomplish their mission. Despite his combat experience, Kornblau admits to being embarrassed when asked what he thinks about while flying missions. I don't regard myself as a brave pilot with brave stories to tell. Usually I'm thinking of many things. Some are related to the mission and how to perform it the best I can, simulating in my mind the critical parts of the mission and what needs to be done. And sometimes I think about lunch or anything else that pops into my mind. I think it's the same for anyone else about to perform something that's important to them. After finishing his time as a fighter pilot in the most advanced plane in the Israeli Air Force arsenal, Kornblau took the knowledge he acquired and moved back to research and development. He said, "The experience gave me the technical knowledge to be able to work on the future of the Air Force and to help develop the technologies of the future." Arik Cherniak is one of Talpiot's most popular graduates. As a competitive teenager, he and his friends were in a constant state of one-upmanship to see who could get into the best army unit. Cherniak wanted to win, but he discounted Talpiot, thinking he'd never get in. so he set his sights on becoming a fighter pilot. As draft day approached, he was invited to come to Talpiot's early testing. When he got there, the officers asked him what he wanted to do. Cherniak was forthright. "I want to be a fighter pilot." "No problem," they laughed. "You can do both." "They sent me to the committee, a testing panel," recalled Cherniak. "1 week before, I had read a book about Einstein's theory of relativity in order to try to look prepared and smart. Everyone needed to prepare something scientific to talk about. Then we talked about physics. They asked me how a solar-powered boiler works, the ones on the roof. They asked me what I would want to study if I weren't in the army, and I said architecture. Then they asked me an architectural problem, and I had to show them how I'd plan a living room. Then they asked me a progressive problem. I even remember it. 61, 55, 52, 63, 94. What's the next number? I stood up at the whiteboard and tried all the various mathematical methods I knew to solve progressions, and they said, "Just flip the order of the digits." And I said, "Oh, right." I looked like an idiot, but it was funny. It was just a trick. Looking back, they just wanted to see how well I could handle pressure. At the end of the testing, I asked again, "Can I still be a pilot?" I wanted to ask as many people as possible to make sure the answer would always be yes, and it was. They were true to their word. While he was waiting to hear back from Talpiot, he accepted an invitation to try out for pilot school. In the Air Force, the training was 7 days with 600 people. They put you in uniform, you spent the day running around, completing orders. There's no English word for what we had to do, but it translates to advancement by the legs. You see that tree? You have 20 seconds to run there and back. Go. You didn't make it? Do it again. There were a lot of group activities and tests like digging holes, solving puzzles, hanging from monkey bars. Everyone hangs and you see who falls first and last. There's really no sleeping. They woke us up after a 2-hour rest. Cherniak made it past all these hurdles, but in the end he thought to himself, "Thanks guys, this is a good fail-safe, but now I'm really hoping to get into Talpiot." As he graduated high school, he still didn't have an answer from Talpiot. One day in the early summer, he was playing on his computer when the call came in. "Congratulations, you've been accepted to Talpiot's 15th class." His first question, "Can I still be a pilot?" His first day in Talpiot, the commanders brought the cadets pizzas and schnitzel. Then wham! It was off to paratrooper training. After 6 days, I could barely move my legs, but I kept going and going. It was a piece of cake compared to what my friends in combat units did, but it was still hard. When classes began, the course load was really heavy, but Cherniak had an ace up his sleeve. He'd always had the ability to concentrate on material in the hours right before a test and to do well. After graduating from Hebrew University and Talpiot's academic program, Cherniak was expected to do 6 months of research and development before doing anything else. It had really been mapped out. His job would to be to work on a new Israeli-made radar system for F-16s, systems the Israeli Air Force would install into the American-made fighter jets. But the Air Base commander where he would serve said, "Enough is enough. If you want to be a pilot, you have to come now." The bureaucratic barriers were crossed, the documents were signed, and Arik Cherniak was off to start army service again from the bottom up. The Ministry of Defense later marked this as a bad decision. In the years afterward, with few exceptions, Talpiot graduates would have to do some work in research and development before moving on to fighting units. Cherniak was finally learning to fly. After graduating flight school, he was given the keys to an F-4 Phantom jet, a fighter bomber once used heavily by the IAF. But soon after he had been assigned to an F-4 squadron, the Air Force decided the plane had seen its best years. Cherniak was disappointed, but happy with his new assignment. To this day, he's a flight instructor in an A-4 Skyhawk. Like the F-4, the A-4 was once a big part of the Israeli Air Force's fighting fleet. The flying skills Cherniak learned in those now outdated planes have still been put to great use. I go to reserves a day or two every 2 or 3 weeks to train pilots in air-to-air combat. I usually teach dogfights. If tomorrow 2 F-16s, one from Egypt, one from Israel, would get in close range, there would be a dogfight. The dogfighting I teach is like teaching someone to dribble. You're not firing bullets, of course. Your goal is to take a picture of the other guy in your gun sights. You're behind him, 300 meters. He's squiggling in the gun sight, and it's all captured on video. When you go down, you debrief to find out who won, who lost, and why. Many of the graduates of Talpiot humbly say no matter what their contribution is to the security of Israel, nothing ever outweighs the sacrifice made by a real fighter. A soldier on the front lines, a fighter pilot flying over enemy territory, or a sailor engaging in battle on the sea. Boaz Ripin of Talpiot's second class knew one incredibly smart young recruit in Talpiot who came from a kibbutz. Ripin said, after a few weeks, he quit. He felt that he couldn't go back to his kibbutz in the uniform of a jobnik. A jobnik refers to a soldier in the Israeli military who doesn't directly fight. He might have a desk job in logistics or in intelligence, or work in the IDF's public relations unit. All are important jobs that make the army and the country run, but they're not seen as risking their lives for the country. The army will always put those who risk their lives on a higher platform. The most extreme case is the fighter pilot. They are looked at differently and always will be, according to Ripin. Of the approximately 700 Talpiot graduates, several decided to move into combat positions, deferring work in research and development or other more traditional Talpiot post-graduation jobs. One of these soldiers came through Talpiot's 11th class. Because of his role in the Talpiot program and IDF service, Israel's Ministry of Defense would not allow his name to be published. He would later become a commander of Talpiot, but before that he worked his way into one of the IDF's most daring units, Shaldag. This small special operations unit is attached to the Air Force. The soldiers in this unit are sometimes dropped deep beneath enemy lines to carry out commando raids and other secret missions. Though they are not pilots, they are responsible for one of the most important tasks in the IAF. It is believed that soldiers from this unit were sent to the Deir ez-Zor region of Syria in the days and weeks before Syria's nuclear reactor was destroyed by Israeli warplanes. They were asked to collect soil samples to make sure the site was what Israel's intelligence community had suspected it was. They used lasers or electronic devices to hit a structure that will help guide bombs or air-to-ground missiles to the exact correct spot. This is especially useful for small and sensitive targets. It's also a way to limit collateral damage when targets are in heavily populated areas, as the enemy often operates in populated areas. When Israel feels it has no choice but to strike those targets in order to protect its own citizens, the desire to limit civilian casualties on the other side is always strong. World opinion quickly turns against Israel when civilians are harmed. That former member of Shaldag is far from being the only Talpiot who morphed into a true commando. Several other Talpiot cadets went to Special Officers School right after graduating and became platoon leaders before going on to join the fighting in Lebanon. The remarkable story of one of those fighters, whose current status and sensitive security position necessitates withholding his name, continues to inspire recruits. I will call him Natan. Friends and soldiers under his command say he's the salt of the earth, and he looks like the warrior he always wanted to be. His hair is cropped short to the skull, built like a middleweight champ. His shoulders are big and broad, not the type of guy you'd dare into a fist fight. Natan is from a small agricultural town a few miles south of Lebanon. A few miles to the east is the Syrian border. As a child, he practiced safety drills, and he remembers the rocket fire from Lebanon being a little too close for comfort. Of the generation called the children of the Yom Kippur War, he was born shortly after the fighting came to an end. At the age of 12, a doctor told him he'd never reach his dream of becoming a fighter pilot because he had far from perfect eyesight. His mother was terribly disappointed for him, but he happily told her, instead of flying planes, I will build planes that don't need pilots. From that point on, without knowing much about Talpiot, he was guiding himself in that direction. Because he feared recruiters would not find him in his small town, Natan decided to apply to Talpiot, a rarity in those days. As he made his way through the labyrinth application process, he was intimidated by the roomful of generals throwing complex questions at him. But it was a kinder, gentler Colonel Avi Poleg who led the interview. The skinny, small-town kid, who would later go on to become an important fighter in the IDF, was asked how a microwave works. I remember having almost no idea, but making up a coherent answer. The rest is pretty much a complete blackout. It was very, very focused and tried to keep my head up and not look down. I came out with almost no recollection of what happened. He also thought his chances of being accepted were zero. As Natan started thinking of alternatives, he heard that more than half of his high school class had been accepted into the paratroopers. Resigned that his weak eyesight would preclude him from going into a combat unit, he thought of doing something else when the phone rang. He'd been accepted to Talpiot. He was ecstatic. His Talpiot class was assigned to basic training with the paratroopers, a unit he'd always admired. While not the top student in his class, when it came to military life, he excelled. This cadet thrived on visits to army outposts, naval ships, air force bases, artillery teams in the field, armoured units, and research and development teams working on exciting futuristic projects. My favourite part of Talpiot was those special sessions when we visited and got training between semesters. I remember coming back home and seeing all my friends who actually went to combat units. I could say, last month I did your training, this month I did yours. The students in his class were known to be exceptionally eager to question the upper echelon of the Israeli High Command. One day, the class toured an Air Force base and heard a lecture from General Avihu Ben-Nun, commander of the Israeli Air Force from 1987 to 1992. As a pilot, Ben-Nun became an ace, with at least 3 confirmed air-to-air combat kills, 2 Egyptian MiGs and a Russian MiG flying for Egypt. He was revered throughout the country. The general was explaining his decision to buy more F-15s than F-16s. The Talpiot class he was addressing had been in the army for less than 2 years. Natan recalls, one of the guys raised his hand and actually challenged him. That was a terrible decision. How could you do that? Can't you see what the Air Force really needs? In the end, Ben-Nun explained why he did what he did, and he clearly won the argument. But in how many countries do 20-year-olds question the wisdom of legends? The student-turned-warrior continued with a mischievous smile. When we met big commanders, it took us no time to ask questions. That was our spirit. Everything was challengeable. I don't know if it was annoying to the commanders and embarrassing to our officers, but as I'm older now, I can see how it would be. As this exceptional young cadet hit the middle of his second year, he began to have second thoughts about the academic track of Talpiot. He loved being in the field and felt that he might be able to contribute more there. He started toying with the idea of going to field officer school with hopes of leading a platoon. His commanders told him they could help him move in that direction, but they urged him to finish his classwork and degree first. Despite enlisting in Talpiot, Natan never lost his desire to become a true warrior. After graduating, his classmates took their assignments, mostly in research and development, while he hit the dirt, literally. He moved back into basic training, then worked his way into officer school and commander's courses. His aim was for a unit that until recently had been a state secret, an anti-tank missile unit. The missile, called Tammuz, is a shoulder-fired guided missile developed by Rafael. It can also be fired from a mounted position on a jeep or small armoured vehicle. It is propelled with a small amount of solid fuel, making reloading relatively easy. The Tammuz has been used several times during the Syrian civil war by Israeli troops patrolling the border. When Syrian mortar shells are fired into Israel by the Syrian army or by rebels, on purpose or accidentally, Israel has often responded by destroying the source of that ground fire with a Tammuz missile. Natan clearly has enjoyed his service in the field and is proud of it. Enthusiastic about the Tammuz, he says, "The missile is guided by a television control. You have a camera at the head of the missile, and you just maneuver the missile to the target. For me, it was a great combination of state-of-the-art technology and a field-focused unit." For more than a dozen years, he was in the same anti-tank unit, a walking, talking tank killer. If war came, his objective would be to use the element of surprise to take out enemy tanks without the IDF having to deploy full tank units in those areas. Among other things, his unit is trained to open fire on tanks several miles away without being detected or traced by the enemy. He's now a lieutenant colonel in the reserves, in charge of up to 400 men, and he trains his teams to be capable of reloading and firing in 15-second intervals. As a reserve officer, he is an anomaly for many reasons, one of which is that he sincerely enjoys his reserve duty. For him, the ideology of service is mandatory. He believes the reserves are the real Green Army and need to stay in shape and stay ready. Our reserves have fought for and saved the country in all of Israel's wars. I found my home here in the reserves. He serves 70 to 80 days a year, a very high rate for Israelis. Most serve in the reserves for a few weeks a year at most. Military historians agree with his assessment of Israel's reserves. Because the standing army only has approximately 175,000 men and women, the reserves are especially crucial. There are almost 4 times as many reserves as there are regular soldiers. In the past, the main goal of Israel's standing army, when under attack, was to hold off the enemy until the reserves could get in place. While warfare has changed, as has Israel's army, generals and political leaders know that surprises happen and the reserves are still held in very high regard throughout the country. This modest Israeli from a small town, who feared he'd have a less than stellar military career, is often asked by Talpiot to come back and lecture to the recruits. Of course, he always says yes. Natan has been instrumental in inspiring more Talpiot graduates to move into the ground forces, and the IDF hopes that still more will follow in his large, capable and dedicated footsteps.